What does it really mean to be triggered? What do we do when we're triggered? And is there a way that we can not be triggered? Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me. So, what does it mean to be triggered? Depending on who you ask, you might get some different answers. But we all experience being triggered in some way or another. Much of the time, we're not necessarily aware of what it is that's being triggered. And that's just natural for most of us. But there can be a number of things that can create a trigger. And ultimately, what being triggered means is that there's something that you're experiencing in a moment, whether it's in your environment, in your thoughts, maybe even an emotion that comes up. There's something that you experience currently that creates an activation in your system, in your body, your nervous system, that typically doesn't feel good. It can sometimes bring up an intense panic. But for a lot of people watching this, while that might be the case on occasion, what tends to happen even more frequently is that there is something that happens and there's this activation in your system that feels pretty intense. You may not know what it's about, you may not know why, but it creates an unsettled feeling. Now, it could be just kind of a minimal unsettled feeling, but oftentimes it's going to be this intense doubt or fear or even shame. Shame is something that is very easily triggered for people that have shame. And pretty much everybody has shame, at least until you've been able to do the healing you need to do to release it. So it's anything that creates this intense feeling. And oftentimes as a result of that feeling, there's a reaction. So being able to recognize that something is triggering you can be really helpful. Not necessarily so that you can avoid it. Now, I think there are times in this process when avoiding things that are triggering can be an important part of what you're actively trying to do. But generally speaking, when we're talking about healing, the goal is not about identifying what triggers you and then avoid it. It's about doing the healing that you need to do so that you're not triggered. Because not only does it not feel good to be triggered in whatever way that shows up for you internally, but when we are triggered, we typically respond to that trigger in an outward way. Now, that outward way could be pulling back from people and isolating, so it's not necessarily affecting other people like really directly, whereas sometimes if somebody's triggered, it can present itself as becoming really angry or aggressive, accusatory, those kinds of things, which obviously is going to have a significant impact on the other person. But again, the goal isn't to avoid being triggered so that you don't have a response. The goal is to heal what needs to be healed so that you are no longer triggered. So that when something reminds you of something, it doesn't create that automatic physiological response in your body that feels really unsafe. So, being able to recognize circumstances in which you tend to have that intense, quick activation happening in your system. That's really important because oftentimes we're not aware that it's happening. So becoming aware of that is incredibly important. Sometimes you may not be aware of it until sometime afterward. It might be fairly quickly afterward, or it might be days afterward. And it might only happen because somebody pointed it out to you, which can often bring up a lot of shame. Not that they're necessarily wrong in pointing it out to you, but it can feel very shameful to have that activation, and especially if we are reacting in a particular way. So becoming aware that that's something that's happening, recognizing what was it that created that. And that sometimes can take quite a bit of work because sometimes we don't know. I would say actually probably often we don't know. So recognizing what it is that's happened, what did it bring up for you? Because it's not the situation specifically that is triggering. It's how that situation feels familiar. So I think an example that a lot of people are aware of when we're talking about triggers is PTSD, true PTSD. And we often tend to think of people who have been in combat. And so one of the things that is mentioned often is if they have been in combat and they come back home and a car backfires, like that can be a trigger. And it can often create a flashback in that moment and take them back and kind of the reliving that experience. So recognizing the situation, right? So it's not the car backfiring that is the problem, because cars are going to backfire. We can't avoid it all the time. But the fact that the car backfiring so quickly and easily feels that panic or creates that panic makes you feel and fear as if you're back in that environment. That is the healing that needs to happen. And there are different ways that you go about that healing, but that sound in that moment is familiar, right? It sounds potentially like a bomb going off or gunfire. And so it's that gunfire sound that feels familiar and takes you right back to that when there was a lot of life and death stuff happening. Maybe even you experience yourself personal significant injury, but it certainly doesn't have to be personal to you. So the situation itself is familiar in some way. So what tends to happen for probably the majority of people watching this isn't so much that, but more things that remind you of something about a feeling or quite often a belief. So, for example, if you believe that people don't like you or won't believe you, this is a huge thing for a lot of childhood trauma survivors. We fear not being believed because we've told ourselves that it's not a big deal, that it didn't really happen, that, whatever. We have done so much groundwork for ourselves, and maybe other people have contributed to that, but we have made ourselves doubt ourselves and not believe ourselves. So it's natural that we fear not being believed and or being judged or blamed. So if that is something that you're feeling really vulnerable around, and some days it might not bother you at all, other days it might bother you a little bit more when this happens. But if you're feeling a little bit more vulnerable around those ideas, and then you share something with somebody, and it could be something seemingly trivial, so not about trauma, not about anything deeply personal or anything like that, but maybe you tell them that you did do something and they can't find it or whatever. In that moment, especially if you're feeling vulnerable, you could easily interpret that as they don't believe you. And because that is something that you've lived with so much of your life, in that moment, that's going to feel very familiar. And in that moment, it can bring up a lot of that fear, doubt, and again, potentially even shame. So it's not so much the way the person has looked at you that is triggering. It's what that look means to you. And that person doesn't have to look at you in like a strange way, like, I don't know about that, or looking at you like you're stupid or something like that. Like their look really could be incredibly benign. But if this is a belief that you've held on to, if it's a fear that you have and you're feeling particularly vulnerable, in that moment, it could trigger the doubt that you have that you will be believed, or about what people think about you. And so in that moment, your nervous system is activated. You are in self-protect mode. And all of those beliefs and the feelings that go along with those beliefs are present as well. So in that moment, because of that way that you've been triggered, so to speak, you are going to respond, right? And so depending on how you tend to respond to things, and again, depending on the day, it might look a little bit different, but you might respond to that by withdrawing, maybe even doubting yourself, maybe apologizing, really going into kind of the fawn sort of phase, kind of people-pleasing thing to try to make it all okay. Or if that triggers shame at all, which it very kind of normally does, it can trigger a response that is more kind of reactionary and aggressive. And you might get mad at that person. You might yell at that person. You might be passive aggressive with that person in that moment. So what I'm talking about it in this way because being able to recognize that there are lots of different ways that we can be triggered on any given day is helpful. Not so much about what are the events that trigger me. And I keep looking over here just because I've got a thing here that I'm kind of looking at as if I was looking at somebody, but it's just a plant. But what is happening in that moment, right? It's not about that thing. What does it mean to me? What is happening? Why am I responding in this way? Because that is really kind of good information about what needs some healing. It's also really helpful information when it comes to how do I kind of show up in relationships? Because when you have experienced childhood trauma, you're kind of always on guard. You're always looking out. And I did a video kind of talking about this a little bit recently, but you're kind of constantly looking out for the thing that might hurt you so that you can protect yourself. Well, when we're already on guard, right, that involves our nervous system, we're in that protective state, and something happens, we're already at a heightened state, then we're going to be in an even more heightened state. When we can recognize that, oh, this is bringing up this, then we can do the work to work on that, but also, in a sense, kind of automatically begin to reduce the activation that we've experienced because we realize that it's not this thing that's right here, right now, that's creating this feeling. It's what this feels familiar to that is creating this feeling. So even if we're talking about being triggered in a way that it brings up a very specific memory. So for example, maybe you see something on television and suddenly you are kind of flooded with a memory and a lot of feeling associated with it. So in that moment, it's not necessarily reminding you of well, I guess it is reminding you of a familiar thing, but it's not specifically about a feeling, right? It's about this memory and the feeling that's associated with it. So recognizing that you've been taken back into this memory. And even with that, being able to recognize, okay, what feelings is it creating for me? Because the difference in getting to a place where you've done all the healing that you need to do and not is that you can still have those memories, right? Those memories aren't suddenly going to evaporate, but you can have the memory and your system not react to it. But when you haven't done the healing yet and you have that memory, your system is reacting to it. It's maybe reacting to what you felt at that particular time. It's definitely going to be reacting to the fears, the doubts, the shame associated with that memory and what you believe about who you are as a result of it. All of that is going to be part of it. So when you are in the healing process, that is a big part of what you are doing, is identifying the things that are happening in your regular everyday life that bring up familiar feelings. Because it's the feelings, the thoughts and the feelings are a cycle. The feelings lead you to more thoughts. And whether the thoughts have memories specifically attached to them, or the thoughts are about the beliefs that you hold about who you are and the world around you. But all of healing ultimately is about dismantling those beliefs, releasing the shame, so that you can connect to the truth of who you are and the power that you as an individual really do hold in your life. So triggers are very real things. And I know that the word is kind of thrown around a lot. And historically, it has meant something quite significant. Again, it was attached specifically to PTSD much of the time. And so people didn't like the idea of being told that they were triggered. Sometimes because when they are triggered, they might show up in a way that makes them feel bad. But a trigger is not good or bad. It's just something that brings up a familiar thought, feeling, or experience. And almost always what's going to leave the most impact is the feeling and any idea or belief attached to that feeling. And the idea could be something you believe about who you are. It could be specifically shame. It could be fear about something happening. So the more awareness we have, the less we tend to be triggered. The more awareness we have, and certainly the more healing we've done, but even just with a lot of awareness, when something does happen and we feel that strong, intense reaction, we can be aware of what's happening. And so in the moment, we can take some deep breaths. We can count to 10, so it brings our focus and our attention to something different than that thing and that feeling. And with practice over time, with healing, whatever it is that created that in the first place, that begins to dissipate. And it's not that things won't remind you of something. It's not that things won't bring up feelings at times. But I think most of you have an idea what I'm talking about when I say that intense reaction, right? There's like this intensity, almost like lightning striking. And all of a sudden there's this like tsunami of feeling. You may not be aware of any feeling, any specific feeling especially, but there's this energy that comes up. And the energy, that's where fight and flight comes from. It might make you want to run. It might make you want to fight, and that's where the aggressive part comes from. The run is withdraw, people pleasing, fawning. So recognizing how and why that is showing up for you is such an important part. recognizing that the goal is not to avoid triggers, and also to recognize that being triggered, being activated, has nothing to do with your strength or weakness. It's not weakness at all, and it really has nothing to do with strength. It's just a reality, and all of us can be triggered by something, right? Like if you think about something that is, I don't know, let's say in, your early years in school, and there was something that happened, not significant really in terms of it being bad or anything like that, but maybe there was show and tell, and somebody brought something in that you really wanted that you don't have. Well, when you experience that, you might have felt envy, jealous. You might have felt, it might have reinforced an idea that you're undeserving or unworthy of that thing. It might have made you feel like you didn't fit in because maybe a lot of other people had it, but you didn't. So in that moment, right, like that situation by itself is not a bad or negative situation, but depending on lots of things that you've experienced already in your life at that time, it may create a feeling for you. And that feeling leads to ideas, and those ideas I just mentioned, which exacerbates the feeling, right? So the thing that's happening in your body, it exacerbates that. So it's a stronger feeling, leads to more thought, often leads to stronger feeling. So you go on through your life and you probably make similar comparisons. If you did that at that time, you're probably likely going to continue that pattern. But later on in life, there's a situation that happens and maybe you don't even want that thing, but maybe it's something that a lot of people want. And you notice all of a sudden feeling like maybe later on in the day, you're noticing feeling maybe a little lonely or a little let down, or maybe the idea of not being deserving or not good enough pops up. And you might not have any idea any of that's going on. You're just maybe noticing not feeling great, maybe not wanting to do something you had planned on doing, not having an interest in eating, or maybe wanting to do something to numb or avoid. But you have no idea what's creating that. Well, while it doesn't create an intense, or it may not have created this really intense feeling, there was something that happened in that was familiar to other times when you have felt that way. So the circumstance could be completely different, which is often part of the reason that we don't connect it, but the feeling is familiar. The ideas associated with that are very familiar ideas. And if you haven't done much healing, there's still beliefs ultimately that you likely hold. And so it reinforces it. In that moment, it reinforces those ideas, those beliefs that you've held on to. So bringing awareness to it, being able to recognize that. What are the situations that you experience, the feelings, the familiar feelings that you experience that create that sort of intense reaction, that intense energy? Doing the work to heal it. But in addition to that, when you have awareness that it's happening, you can then do things in the moment. So literally taking a few breaths, doing something to become very present, recognizing, okay, wait a minute, this is just feeling familiar right now. And then being really intentional and mindful about practicing self-compassion around that. Because what often tends to happen is you start being critical of the way that you're feeling, or that it's affecting you. You say things to yourself like, what the hell's wrong with you? Or why would you feel that way? Or you're making a big deal out of nothing. And, all those things that we tend to say to ourselves. And that is not helpful. In fact, it's actually incredibly harmful. So recognizing it and then meeting it with self-compassion is really, really important. And you are deserving of that self-compassion, the same as everybody else's. Well, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your experiences. What came up for you? Share it below in the comments. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and if you found it helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can more easily find the video. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.